All right, welcome. Can everybody hear me? Hopefully we're good. I can't talk. We got the man, our good friend, Father Dcn Dr Ananias, joining me today to do a a review of the Stefan M0lyneux debate from a couple nights ago. Father Dcn, how are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.
And yeah, this is going to be exciting to go through and talk about what I thought was actually a wonderful debate and discussion from both of you.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was not the debate I expected. I actually expected it to be more of a heated confrontation, and that's okay. We actually had a friendly conversation, so that worked out good. It was the discussion that needed to happen. Maybe not the one that everybody expected, but it's the discussion we needed. So
Right.
So props to Stefan. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for that engaging chat. Hopefully we will have a part two, a sequel. We'll see. He seemed open to that idea, but we also want to plug your channel. I do have it linked below if you want to follow Father Dcn Dr Ananias. He does a lot of courses on logic and philosophy. Compatriot, comrade, as a fellow agent in the Russian propaganda matrix that we inhabit. I'm joking.
Hey, you're not supposed to say that. We agreed before the.
We agreed. No more
secret.
No more of Russian agency.
Yeah.
All right. The agent intellect or the Russian agent intellect? If
you're good one. The Russian agent intellect.
Yes, very, very good. Is only a property necessary to perceive Putin truth. All right. You are going to do a logic chat. We want to plug that. So that will be available. Is it Monday, right?
Monday, yeah. And I was trying to get the preferred times from people. It looks like that the preferred time is going to be 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
Okay.
And for those of you who can't make it, it's going to be recorded, and then I'll make that available. As far as the frequency of lectures, that's going to be up to all of you. So if once every week or maybe perhaps every 2 weeks might be good.
So if you want to take that course, easiest way to get to you would be to subscribe to your channel and then reach you on what means.
Right. So there's a video that I did announcing the course, and so you can basically message me there, or my email is posted in the description on that video. So any of those, and with your registration of the course, you'll get the free PDF book, which is a $90 book for free, and slides with the course, as well as the lecture videos recorded.
Well, that'll be hype. Awesome. Looking forward to that. I'm going to sit in. It's been a long time since I've had any logic classes, probably 10 years since I was in a logic class, maybe more. So a refresher is always good to have. And we will also be covering the Super Chats at the end of the show. So you can support us with Super Chats. You can also subscribe to my channel, get access to all of the Part 2 content. Or you can go to jasonanalysis.com and subscribe there as well. So welcome, everybody. We got a full house, it looks like. For in the middle of the day, that's pretty good. We've got 225 in the middle of the day, but we're going to do a debate review. So let's start out. So, what's your overall assessment first, and then we'll get into the specifics.
Again, very impressed with M0lyneux. I want to give a shout out to. He was very cordial, and he seemed that genuinely had an interest in learning. What these terms were, some more background and information, the history about these philosophical debates. And that was amazing. I was actually really impressed with his overall general attitude and willingness to learn and discuss these issues. So I want to give a shout out to M0lyneux on that. That was very good. And I'm sure that made it pleasant for you too, to discuss a lot of these issues.
Yeah, it was a long time coming. We had been talking about that. I did a critique 4 years ago, and I may have gotten some facts about him wrong, not intentionally, but I was a little more. I was new to podcasting. I didn't really know what I was doing 4 years ago, so I kind of rambled for about 3 hours. And if you're new to podcasting, that's what you'll do. You'll kind of ramble on. So I didn't really know where I was going to take the critique, but I just kind of went into in essence the same critique that I made in the debate. So most of the issues that I brought up in terms of the philosophy itself, I would still hold to those being a valid criticism. And they're kind of the issues that I brought up in the debate. So I brought up, issues like the myth of the given, issues like the external world, the problem of induction, the status of abstract objects, identity over time, all these kinds of issues that are persistent problems in the state of the question, as Eternal Logos called it, within academia. Those are still issues, still being debated in the realm of the philosophy of mind, philosophy of consciousness, all this kind of stuff. Empirical data is just not enough to really get us to these assumptions that are necessary for empirical data to be coherent and meaningful. So I think that there was a lot of kind of pragmatic, relying on pragmatism, and really that's not an out. I think that's what a lot of people in the modern world think in the realm of philosophy is like, well, look, we're at a dead end in a lot of these systems. We might as well just act as if, right? And kind of that's the way Hume himself, the consistent skeptic, Hume took it to that logical outworking a long time ago. He said, look, we're going to act as if there's an external world. We're going to act as if induction is true, et cetera, all these other things. We can't justify them in a strict logical sense, but we're going to operate as if they're true. And so therefore we're going to leave all those metaphysical questions and those strict epistemic questions. We're going to put those in the back burner or just toss them out wholesale and no longer countenance them. But what is the problem? I want to ask you, Father Deacon Dr. Ananias. I know how I would answer it, but I want to see how you would answer it. What is the problem with just saying, well, look, let's just be pragmatic. Who cares about these goofy, word salad explanations of trying to explain things like metaphysics and give an account for, a justification for, a sufficient reason for our beliefs? Why don't we just rely on pragmatism?
Yeah, and by the way, let me just give you a shout out for being able to explain things in the terms of the history of philosophy is really important. So there's always a danger that you can get so narrow within one's field. This typically happens with scientists that they'll end up dealing with issues that they don't know that have actually been resolved or abandoned. And so going back to the history of philosophy, as you did in the video too, you were able to cite that, look, these conversations and debates and these time periods have been going on and they've shown us this. That's really important. And so I think it was good that you did that. Mm-hmm. Now, regarding your question, so part of it is answering the question here about why can't we just be pragmatic and just deal with what works. So there's basically two questions that need to be answered within that. Pragmatism is goal-oriented towards the telos.
Right.
And what happens within pragmatism then is that the goal that you're trying to pragmatically obtain is going to be called into question as being arbitrary. For example, we could be quite pragmatic about a euthanasia program or eugenics. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we're going to have to answer, well, what justifies us? Are these good goals? So immediately you're within the realm of the normative as soon as you're talking about pragmatics. And pragmatics wants to try to eliminate that.
Yeah.
And just, well, we don't have to think about normativity or anything like that. But again, it becomes arbitrary.
Right.
Do we just pick any kind of goal that we want? And then, of course, we can talk about efficiency, i.e. pragmatism. But that doesn't really make any sense. I think most people would agree that, well, it's not good to be pragmatic about certain sorts of things.
Yeah, once we talk once we talk about the good, we're talking about value judgments. That's the domain beyond. I mean, it's ethical, but it's also the domain. It starts to edge over into metaphysics, because what is the good? You can't really make value judgments without some notion of the good. Even if you think the good is just your own personal tastes or subjective preferences, that's still some conception of a good. And so it's unavoidable, right? Those kinds of questions, again, as you said, presuppose telos, and they presuppose some kind of notion of the good.
And the other thing too, and maybe it's perhaps revealing of one's kind of philosophical commitments, but it's reductive. The animal kingdom is entirely pragmatic, but what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom? We're not just pragmatic. Again, we have we have knowledge, and so immediately you're going to have the issue of justification. My justify, and both in an epistemological sense, in a normative sense too, as far as values and the good, right and wrong, that if you say, well, let's just focus on what works and what's pragmatic, in that sense, you're returning us back to beasts.
Yeah.
Is
that better?
Just, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just a machine or something like that. I think most people intuitively would know that, well, we're much more than machines or animals. Now, perhaps they don't live this out in their philosophy consistently, but it's easy to show inconsistencies that as soon as you burn down their home and take all their property and kill their family, because, well, that's just most pragmatic and efficient for me to kind of survive.
Yeah.
Now, all of a sudden, the morals and the normativity comes in.
Let's talk first about the issues that were raised early on about justifying our claims, giving a sufficient account and reason, basis for our beliefs. What are warranted beliefs? What are properly basic beliefs? Could you walk us through some of these things and explain why I raised, I know why I raised them, but I know you could probably explain it better. Why do you think we would raise these questions about justifying our beliefs and claims to an empiricist? Can't they just get around all this stuff by saying, well, I just appeal to sense data, and if it matches up 1-to-1, what's the problem?
Right. So, I mean, even if you assume that somebody forms a belief, which I think M0lyneux was saying, you just look and you have a belief in it.
Yeah.
It matches reality.
Right.
So one question, that could be, but the question when it comes to warrant or justification is, how do we know that or determine that that's the case? And second of all, a further issue comes up, even granting, let's say, how many jelly beans in the jar, and you say 250, you could formulate a belief that ends up being true that doesn't constitute as knowledge. Because what if it was a lucky guess? And so here comes in the notion of warrant or justification. We realize that simply having a belief that matches reality, i.e. a true belief, is not sufficient or enough to count as knowledge. That we need to have proper warrant or evidence or good reasons for believing that. So if you asked, well, why do you believe there's 250 jelly beans in the jar? And somebody says, I don't know, I just guessed that. And what happens to be true, none of us would say, well, yeah, that person has knowledge.
Right.
Now, if they said, well, I counted all the jelly beans, then we have a notion of some type of sufficient evidence or justification to back up that belief being true. And then we might actually say, well, on those grounds, that would satisfy for us saying that person probably knows there's 250 jelly beans in the... So that was something that was probably missed in the debate.
If you're Tristan, you would take that jar of jelly beans and you would throw it out the window.
Yeah, that's right.
And it would roll down the hill, roll down the mountain for the Mexican children to eat.
Don't you guys have
the Mexican children in Ecuador?
Yeah, don't you guys have meat jelly beans? We keep meat jelly beans in our house. I don't.
Oh, meat jelly beans. That's a great idea.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, jelly beans are non-canonical up in this house.
They're non-canonical.
Sugar jelly beans.
Okay.
That's yeah. So that was an issue that, again, perhaps M0lyneux would be interested in the difference between simply, do I have a belief that matches reality? Then the second question, how would I determine? So as you'd said, that's a meta level question. And so now I think that there was kind of, when the use of meta was kind of taken in a kind of colloquial sense, or at least he was interpreting it. In Greek, it just means, after or next. So if you're treating a certain issue and then you want to rise up kind of a level and analyze that, well, you're taking a meta step. You're taking the next step and looking at. So that step right there, as far as my beliefs might be true and map onto reality, but how would I determine that? And then second, how would I be justified is a meta level question.
No. Metaphysics is when you walk into Barnes and Noble and you see the witchcraft section and it says metaphysics, and you start reading the books on how to cast love spells on your favorite coworker. That's what metaphysics is. That's what I was invoking, was the Harry Potter section of Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, that's when we knew civilization was basically going downhill, is when they changed metaphysics to be tarot card reading.
It's the tarot section of the Barnes and Noble. No, so yeah, I mean, it's just asking the question at a sort of a different order, a different level. But in themselves, I mean, you could have a metaphysics that is completely materialist. So just using or analyzing something in a metaphysical sense is not to necessarily affirm all of these abstract immaterial entities per se. I mean, I believe that there are abstract conceptual entities, but just doing metaphysics, I mean, there are plenty of people who are metaphysicians and do metaphysics who don't believe in those things, right? I mean, it kind of depends on where you take that question. But let's see well,
let's keep going on, because there was a certain issue with the.
I know what I want to talk about.
For example, I think he presented sort of kind of a naive realism that you just look at it and you see that there's 7 coconuts and
naive realism is not a knock at somebody. It's not like a pejorative. It's like a position, like naive empiricism.
It's actually it's a type of position that. But the thing is, again, that's to ignore the distinction between perception and justification. So we need to carve out these categories. For example, just because the majority of us see something a certain way does not mean that our seeing, and therefore then from there our judgments about what we're seeing, map onto reality. And I think that was kind of the assumption. For example, and it's not just, well, because the majority of us see it this way. Well, what if the majority of us were schizophrenic? And there was kind of some common, there was something common among our schizophrenia that made us see certain things. And there is. When you look at the diagnosis for schizophrenia, you have common traits. But all of us would admit that the schizophrenic is not perceiving or let alone judging reality correctly. So it's just taking for granted that because I guess I'm not like a schizophrenic, that therefore I am. Now, that's a question of justification.
Right.
And one's not justified in saying that, well, just because I can see it, how can you deny that? Yeah. Well, you could be psychologically predisposed to see things incorrectly.
Well, there's also kinds of people. There's also an explanation. There's also a story narrative that's told early on in his book about the progress of human civilizations, from most people in the ancient and medieval world seeing things in this superstitious story narrative, and then the philosophers and the rational Enlightenment skeptics come along and destroy those and give us a new narrative. And so he really presents it's like the heroes of science and scientism, this kind of Bertrand Russell style narrative at the beginning of Russell's books. He does this same thing too, which is ironic because the people living in those days could appeal to the common perceptions of there being metaphysical categories and metaphysical entities and objects that are real. So, in other words, you can never rely on that kind of a thing like common notions or the opinions of the masses on those subjects, and then turn around and utilize the narrative of how the Enlightenment smashed all the common notions that were all nonsense and superstitious. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Now, his way out, because I know he was going this way, was to move into the pragmatism. Yeah. Well, if it's not mapping onto reality, it wouldn't work. Things wouldn't work out. But this is what's nice about the Duhem-Quine thesis of the underdetermination of data. There's many different kind of conclusions we can take from their thesis, but what that shows is that there are multiple theories or paradigms or viewings that are all different, making different claims about what the data is that you're seeing, the appearances, that will all work perfectly well. In fact, the classic example is comparing the Ptolemaic geocentric universe to the Copernican heliocentric universe. They both work. So this is another failure of pragmatism. From this kind of naive realism, like sense datum theorists, that we'll just look at the data and we just see as the way it really is in reality, and the confirmation of that is it works, is completely undermined by Duhem and Quine's underdetermination of data thesis, which shows that, well, no, there's going to be multiple paradigms and theories, perhaps even an infinite amount of them, that will all fit the data perfectly well. And that will all pragmatically work. So you get stuck there too. Right.
And this also brings up the next problem that I touched on in the discussion in a few places, which was properly basic and non-properly basic beliefs, because what we're talking about there, that explanation you gave about pragmatism and things, quote, working, that's all premised on, again, that older notion of classical foundationalist approaches to how we know and what we can know and so forth. And it's sort of like based on an older one-to-one correspondence between the idea and the object and the word, just a simple signification theory. But there's big problems with the correspondence theory of knowledge. And when we talk about coherence, we're not saying that we have to adopt a strictly secular coherence theory of truth or truth statements or knowledge. What we're saying is that there's aspects of the coherence theory which are more applicable to a holistic orthodox paradigm, but there's also aspects of correspondence which are applicable as well, and there's also pragmatic aspects. So all the various theories of truth and truth statements, truth values, correspondence, coherence, pragmatism, we would say there's aspects of those which are correct, but we don't smush our whole epistemology or view of truth into any one of those singular sort of secular schools, because they end up in kind of problems. So point being here is just that we want to pull from where there's truth and reject where there's error in any type of philosophical argumentation or system. And so when I mention properly basic and non-properly basic beliefs, this is another problem that comes up in the classical foundationalist model, which is that, setting aside all the other assumptions that we've already mentioned that are not justified, even if you think that you have a properly basic axiom or starting point in your system, once you start reasoning about the world from that basis, there's not anything that tells you on empirical bases which beliefs in your system are actually properly basic and which ones aren't, because if that belief in any way relies on or is related to or connected in a web to another belief, then how do you adjudicate between the properly basic one and the non-properly basic belief? And if you tried to do that, what that assumes is some prior criteria that's more basic to adjudicate between the two, and that's also not proven empirically. So that was another point that I brought up about properly basic beliefs. That's a problem for the classical foundationalists, and I think that it was just kind of sort of blown past. It was kind of dismissed.
Yeah, and we can kind of unpack these terms too and what they mean and the historical significance. I thought you had a good point right there about this kind of correspondence theory of truth, whereby our words are sentences and predications map on an isomorphic one-to-one relationship with the things of intention out there in the world. And this is why it's good for all of you to study the history of philosophy, at least in a general way. For example, you'll see that these issues are treated within the philosophy of the history of philosophy. For example, you'll find that Carnap was actually in his Der logische Aufbau der Welt in 1928. He tried to execute this kind of program of, I guess we'd call it a reductionist program as far as meanings of words, having this kind of one-to-one isomorphic reduction, and also the truth value too. And he came the closest to it, but it ultimately fails too. And this is where you get people like Wittgenstein too, that talks about that, the old kind of classical foundationalist coherence model. Sorry, not coherence. Correspondence. That, the word tree maps on kind of one-to-one relationship to the entity that I'm pointing at right now. Seems to work fine until you get to things like and, or, but. How do you explain that in terms of kind of correspondence there? What do they correspond to? And what you find is they operate much more.
I know what but corresponds to.
Oh, yeah. Bruh.
I couldn't pass that one up.
Yeah.
But you're talking about conjunctions.
Yeah, that this is why he comes up with kind of the language game theory that, they operate much more in a functional role. Now, things have functions just like you would like in with the, pawn and rook, the knight on the chess, that they have their role and function not atomistically isolated, but within the whole structure of all the game and all the other player, the other pieces within the chess game.
Right.
And that this kind of opened up a new way of thinking about truth and meaning in language that seemed to show a fundamental problem with the older view.
Yeah, I've later reflected numbers are a good example of this kind of stuff too. If you think about like the number three doesn't operate in isolation from the other sets of numbers that you could come up with. I mean, does it really make sense to talk about 3 without also thinking about 1 and 2? No. So there's not really any epistemic priority or metaphysical priority that can be assigned right away on the basis of empiricism to any content, any proposition, anything that we think might be in the created realm to be given some kind of epistemic priority. It just simply doesn't have that. And on the non-theist worldview. Now, if you have our worldview, you can sort of redefine these things. You can talk about foundational beliefs or maxims or whatever as starting points in logic and all that, but their ground and their justification is actually outside of the system itself. In other words, that outside, you can't just take something from logic or from mathematics and then justify the system of mathematics from within the system, right? It appeals outside of it. It's incomplete. And so we're just simply saying that this is a feature of anything in the created world. You get this strange loop feature about things in the created world where ultimately you can't just appeal to some other created thing. So the argument is the same in any subject. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about logic or whether we're talking about empirical sense data, or whether we're talking about math, or whether we're talking about whatever, causal principle, telos, right? The 5 ways, any of those things presupposes prior categories. So what I would like to ask you next is that you discuss this move in your paper that you presented, which I enjoyed. Tell us what Aristotle means, because this is crucial for not just the Enlightenment era proponents of foundationalism, which is where we would find M0lyneux on that spectrum. But if we were to rewind and go back in time to Aquinas, adopting this Aristotelian move from objects or that which is better known by us versus what is better known by nature. Can you unpack that for us? Because this is so crucial in the history of Western thought up into the eventual dominance in the West of foundationalism.
Right. So foundationalism starts with Aristotle. So you find this in his logical works, like the Organon in Posterior Analytics, where he's kind of setting out what he says a scientific demonstration is, where you have premises and then a conclusion, and that the premises must be always better known than the conclusion, and that the premises are then conclusions of previous demonstrations, which ought to be better known, and so on and so on. And he immediately comes to the conclusion that, well, it can't just be demonstrations all the way back ad infinitum, that at some point has to stop where there is no demonstration. So there's no demonstration for demonstration. This is what classical foundation, this is where it begins.
Right.
Classical foundationalism. And so he believes that ultimately demonstrations rest on a bedrock of first principles, self-evident truths. So that could either be, axioms or kind of analytic propositions. For example, the whole is always greater than the part. Or in this sense, sensations. That what we would call, this is what we meant by or at least you did, basic, rather properly basic, excuse me. That of which everything else is founded on, is built from. Otherwise, he says you couldn't have knowledge. So that kind of sums up where classical foundationalism comes.
Can I read this section just to make sure that this is, we know Aristotle? I know you know this, but we want the audience to know real quick what Aristotle says.
From the Posterior Analytics.
Yeah, I've got it right here. He says, the premises must be primary and indemonstrable. Otherwise, they will require demonstration in order to be known. Since to have knowledge, if it be not accidental knowledge of things which are demonstrable, means precisely to have a demonstration of them. The premises must be the causes of the conclusion, and therefore better known than it. And prior to it, its causes, since we possess scientific knowledge of a thing only when we know its cause, prior, in order to be causes, antecedently known, this antecedent knowledge being not our mere understanding of the meaning, but knowledge of the fact as well. Now, prior and better known are ambiguous terms, for there's a difference between what is prior and what is better known in the order of being, and what is prior and better known to man.
Right. So that basically segues us right into the classic Aristotelian phrase, of which Aquinas adopts, to that which is better known by us versus that which is better known by nature. And it's really a distinction between a kind of an ontological versus an epistemological. So how we know is different than the way reality may actually be. And this is kind of aligned with like Aristotle's, for example, potency and actuality. Which one comes first in order of time? Like I'm potentially to the end of the street. Well, I'm not actually at the end of the street. So potency is always first in time, but I couldn't potentially be at the end of the street unless there was actually an end of the street to go to. So he has this kind of way of thinking about, and says that, look, what makes something real, the reason why something exists is what, in the cause is what's better known by nature. So it's kind of like the in itself. But we don't proceed in that way. We always proceed not by cause to effect in the terms of our knowing or
But
order
from the
of knowing.
effect back to the cause.
Effect to the cause. So this is what's going to make his kind of empiricism.
Yeah.
We start from
Induction.
the sensibles. We start from induction, that we sense, and that's always clear to us, and the cause is more removed, and then we find out the cause. So that's basically, it's just explain that fancy phrase, what's better known by nature versus what's better known by us. Now, as I illustrate in the paper, though, that's an epistemological concept of criteria for justification. And so what you can immediately ask is that not begging the question? Are you not getting ahead of yourself? That you're assuming that's the mode of knowing to prove that that's your mode of knowing. Exactly. And that's a move that's not allowed, at least in sophisticated epistemology.
Right. And keep in mind, too, that it wasn't common. This is something we always have to stress, because you'll get like people who are Thomists who will take issue with this. We have to explain that, look, people weren't asking questions at that paradigmatic level per se in the ancient and medieval world. Now, you get inklings of this at times, right? In Metaphysics Book 4, Aristotle does respond to a paradigmatic level challenge from the sophists. It's his, what I think is a transcendental argument. I don't know why anybody would dispute that, but it's Book 4, Chapter 4, and he begins that section of the Metaphysics by talking about a transcendental type of argument for logic itself against the sophists. He calls it a negative proof. That is a transcendental argument. It's not that hard to get, right? So there are inklings of this stuff going on, but as Father Deacon is pointing out, it wouldn't have occurred in Aristotle's mind at that time to question that move that he's making. In other words, the move of assuming the properly basic axioms in induction itself can't give you the justification for induction, for the move from reading from the causes knowledge back into the effects. Now, it's not to say that there's not causal relations in the world. There are, and we do know things causally. There is telos, there is cosmology, there is the cosmological principle, but that's different from giving a justification for it or a reason for it. And if we're not going to be circular, and no classical foundationalists can admit to being circular, you have to reject circularity, then you can't appeal to sense data to prove the validity of sense data.
Yeah, and again, this is something that I work out in my paper too. Another way that it's sort of epistemic bootstrapping and begging the question, and people don't think in this kind of paradigmatic way,
right,
that we often just grant people all kinds of things that have not actually been established yet. So you'll see it this way in kind of classical foundationalism, this sort of kind of empiricism, is that it's already assumed that we're constituted such either, biologically or mentally with our concepts such that we can even know it at all. And then based on that, you make an epistemic claim about the justification of how we know. So what I point out, and I also point out in my paper, is that that's epistemic bootstrapping.
Yeah.
That you can't, if you haven't established that from either the world itself, like as Aristotle points out, from basic, kind of empirical sensations, or man himself in his own mind with his own sphere of reason, if you haven't been able to show or determine that we can know anything at all, why should we grant that you can just go on and then tell us how you can know? For example, going back to the schizophrenic example, we definitely would all admit that, well, I guess being constituted in certain ways or taking certain kinds of drugs would make it such that you're not actually knowing or perceiving reality correctly. And so then it calls into question, well, how do I determine
hold on. Is this just a schizophrenic or a schizophrenic on drugs?
I'm constituted such, both biologically and mentally, such that I can.
Hold on, Father.
And then you go on to use the exact things that are in question. Yeah.
Your mic cut out there for a little while, but first of all, we need to establish if this is just a normal schizophrenic, or you said a schizophrenic on drugs. Wouldn't that be like a super
or
like
drug. Yeah, that would be a double.
Meta schizophrenia.
Or maybe it gets them straight. Maybe that's
Okay.
if you had the right drugs, it
Right.
would. No, but
So
the idea
rewind a
is
little bit
either
because
drugs.
you cut out though when you were talking about this. So go back a little bit.
So yeah, we would all admit that either drugs or alcohol, or certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia, we admit. I think all of us that well, yeah, that's definitely not constitute such a way that you're perceiving reality correctly or knowing. And then we just assume that, well, like the publican and the Pharisee. Well, thank God I'm not like that guy, right?
Yeah.
That, and if you ask the person, well, wait a minute, how do you determine, locked within just either the world itself or within your own sphere of reasoning, that you're capable of knowing? And what are they going to do? They're going to give you some type of argument, which is exactly what's in question.
Yeah.
So that's why the book example. If the book's in question, and I told you everything in this book is true, and you say, well, how do you determine that or know that? And I said, well, you got to just turn to page 27 where it says everything in this book is true. That's an invalid move. Yeah. And aren't we doing something like this when it comes to epistemology? Certainly the classical foundationalist, I'd argue that even the different coherentist models, are all caught up in epistemic bootstrapping. They're assuming what they want to prove and that its processes are legitimate and can acquire a criteria for their justification before they've established their criteria for justification.
Exactly. Now, what would you reply? I know how I would reply, but how would you reply to somebody who says, well, that's impossible. You just can't do that. There's no way to justify these assumptions. I remember the debate with Matt Dillahunty. This was essentially the move that Dillahunty said, look, you can't prove a presupposition. What are you talking about? If you could, it wouldn't be a presupposition. There's no proofs for those things.
Oh, so he's going back to another foundational model. Right?
Well,
is that
yeah,
what he's saying? But so by definition, presupposition. Right? So the way that you, and well, I think that Bahnsen pointed this out, right? The fallacy of the
crackers in the pantry.
What was it? Crackers in the pantry fallacy.
The crackers in the pantry fallacy.
The way that you investigate or look for evidence or test things is not going to be the same. The way that you look for crackers in the pantry is going to be different than the way that you look to test other things. And so when it comes to presuppositions, the way that you test that, obviously you're not going to, well, that has to fit. Go ahead.
And what Bahnsen means quite literally is like a group of white people that he has stuck in his pantry. The way that you're going to prove that you have a group of honkies in the pantry is not the same way that you prove other propositions in your world. No, I'm joking. No. So,
I didn't know where you're going with that at first when you started saying white people in the pantry.
Father Deacon, this is Dr. Greg Bonson. I have about 7 white people in my pantry. It's a logical fallacy.
Anyway, I've been working on my Bahnsen, but anyway, yes, you're correct.
So anyways, the way that we're going to test presuppositions is going to be a very different way than you would test, for example, deductive or inductive conclusions derived from deductive or inductive arguments. That we're going to look that you're going to test more for kind of coherence and consistency. Right. In fact, this is exactly a type of argument that would be, how do you test presuppositions if you can't prove them? By way of reductio ad absurdum. Yes.
That's so, for example, the move that Aristotle himself makes in Book 4 of the Metaphysics that I just referenced, which I'm not saying is true because Aristotle did it. It's not a fallacy of authority. I'm just saying that the argument has precedent in the history of ideas. The argument itself is valid, and as you point out in your paper, and as I put up in the debate, I mean, you can put, there's a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be a 5-point syllogism. You can put a transcendental argument into a very simple syllogism. I mean, Kant gives transcendental arguments quite consistently that are valid in their form.
So the idea is, if your presupposition leads to an absurdity or inconsistency, you should probably abandon it. That's one way. That's a reduction.
And that's exactly what Stefan argues in his book, that there are self-detonating arguments or moves that are essentially self-destructive. And so he affirms essentially transcendental argumentation in his book.
Right. Now, that at the same time is not going to get you out of the epistemic quagmire of circularity.
Right. Correct. Because
somebody could say, well, it's undeniable. I can't deny it without contradicting myself, and therefore, if it's either A or B, and I can't conceive of B, it must be A. But then to actually make the claim that therefore I'm justified in believing A is not a valid claim, because again, you're already presupposing that the validity of that method is within the epistemic domain that works and could be justified. You haven't shown that. And second of all, what if you're just, again, psychologically preconditioned to think that way? It's like, I just can't think otherwise. It's an invalid move to therefore conclude, but that's the way the structure of the universe is, and therefore what I'm thinking therefore maps onto reality, and I have justification for that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the external world is nothing but pure popcorn, and all of the world of pure popcorn just constantly signifies the informational content to my brain of the world that we think it is. So I think that I'm interacting with Father Dcn Dr Ananias. You're nothing but a giant bag of popcorn, and the informational content that's coming into me appears to be Father Dcn Ananias, but you are Father Dcn Popcorn. You're just a giant bag of popcorn.
Yeah, that brings up, do you want to move into the point about the 7 coconuts? Because that...
You put the lie in the coconut, together, put the lie in the coconut.
Do you know what's so funny? So there must be something with so yesterday in class, I kid you not, I was handing out the quizzes, and like every row ended up being 7. And then ended up being like every example was like 7. And then I was just like, you know what, might as well just start using 7 coconuts in the examples in class.
Synchronicity, time to get out your Gematria calculators and figure out the Mandela effect, CERN.
Yeah.
CERN was causing the matrix simulation that we inhabit to configure 7s to... I'm joking.
Where did the coconuts come from? Were you looking at, coconuts or something? Like, who knows where like these examples...
Well, I think, if just like Stefan, if you're a philosophy person, if you followed us, and you do the same thing, like we love to think of ridiculous examples.
Right.
We just whatever pops in the head, right? So we love these silly examples.
Yeah, if we didn't do that, do you know how boring philosophy would be?
Super boring.
Like, I'm not. Yeah. If there's not, coconuts and popcorn and these weird, examples of being people tied up on a trolley and tracks and stuff like that. Like, why would anybody want to?
You put the lime in the coconut. Put both together. Put the lime in the coconut, and you feel better. You know that song, right? The lime in the.
Yeah,
coconut.
I know that.
I'm joking.
I don't remember the author.
The lime in the coconut.
So, anyways, it brings up a point that I wanted to discuss related to what you were saying with the popcorn, that I thought aptly applied to the 7 coconuts examples. You just look at and see that there's 7 coconuts there.
Yeah.
And then I guess you get confirmation too that, do you see 7 coconuts there too? I do. So now it's out of the realm of subjectivity, and then do you think you have justification for some type of objectivity?
But just begging the question, brah.
Yeah. So if, for example, what if there's actually in reality 5 coconuts, and again you're so constituted such that the 5 coconuts actually produces the idea of 7 coconuts? That doesn't.
Yes,
so you can't.
That's why I was bringing in the pop. I mean, the popcorn stuff was so silly. I think I lost people on the popcorn thing, but same principle here. Like, just because. Maybe the whole universe is just one big piece of popcorn, and it signifies to us all these different things that we think it is, right? I mean, the point is just to illustrate that there's no way to, through empirical sense data, prove that the informational content in the mind matches up to what's being impressed upon from the external world, right? I mean, it's assuming there's an external world, and it's assuming the continuity of the informational content from the external world to the mind, and that's what you can never get just by appealing to the external world, because that's what's under question.
Yeah, that points out the whole, what you and I discussed and I gave in the conference, that, and this ties into the myth of the given.
Yes, let's talk about this. So this is another problem that I brought up too. So tell us about the myth of the given. It's brought up at the beginning of Sellers' Empiricism, the Philosophy of the Mind, which is a pretty standard book on this, as well as the Bonjour text, which...
And then Empiricism, the Philosophy of Mind, by Willard Sellers. I almost said Wilfred. Wilfred. Wasn't that a movie with the guy with the rats?
Willard?
What was that?
Yeah.
Willard, the creeper with all the rats.
Right.
Chew 'em up, boys, chew 'em up.
Wilfred Brimley. Diabetes.
Okay, so anyway, Sellers talks about the myth of given. So he's really referring to what in epistemology became sense datum theorists, which are classical foundationalists in the empiricist variety. And Sellers basically says, look, the whole point, that the reason why they come up with this kind of epistemological category of the given is really just to explicate the idea that all our empirical knowledge rests on a foundation of non-inferential knowledge of matter of fact. So what do I mean by non-inferential? So, well, let's start with inferential. To make an inference is to move from either one argument to the next or one concept to the next. But again, this is to return back to what Aristotle was talking about. If there's just an infinite regress of logical inference, there can be no knowledge. So what is posited? Well, kind of a basic non-inferential, just a matter of fact. It has to, the buck has to stop somewhere. And it stops in what's called the given. It's just given. Can't question anymore because it's just given. Otherwise, you're back on the infinite regress again. That's what, in short, I know it's more complicated than that, but in short, that's what the given is. And he says that's a myth.
Right.
And the problem is that you have this principle of like knows like. So, for example, the reason why I can, and this is between analogies, it's also between like contact, and anything that relates to another thing must have some type of principle of analogy between that like knows like. For example, if I wasn't physically constituted, guess what? I wouldn't be moving physical things.
Right. So how
I would go.
Yeah.
It would be like the movie, like you always see like Ghost or something. These Hollywood movies, right, where they try to reach for the glass or the cup and they just go through it. That kind of illustrates, because their substance is very different and not like the physical substances.
I was thinking of Patrick Swayze, because he sings.
Yeah, so was that.
He sings "She's Like the Wind," but when he's a ghost, he's like the wind. Oh, that was dumb, but yes.
Yeah. Don't ever do that again, please.
I'm like the wind. Anyway.
So, okay, here's what sets up the problem. That's the myth of the given. Is that givens, epistemic givens, because they're non-inferential, they don't have logical content. They're fundamentally different than your concepts and logic, of which you're supposed to derive, and which all of your
through inference
inferential knowledge rests on, as matter of facts, correct?
Yeah.
And the problem then is going to come up, well, how does what's essentially different relate to the other if there's no similarity? And there's a great quote from Donald Davidson in his coherence theory of truth and knowledge, where he states the relation between sensation and belief cannot be logical. So that's exactly what we just stated. Every classical foundationalist is going to admit that. Because it's not like, is there logic in the sensation? Are there concepts? Yeah. Of course it's not. They're just, especially when you get into the later empiricist, it's just like David Hume, it's just a sense manifold.
Right.
just like a bunch of particles and stuff like that. There's no concepts or forms or anything like that.
Yeah. So there's not actually informational content that's transferred to the mind. That's what I was trying to say, is that you're assuming to be able to reason about the world that there is informational content that matches up to the external. But if we just reduce our ideas or our concepts to brain states, how is a brain state like something in the external world? It's not.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's no way to relate the two. So already you have a problem of you have this gap.
This is just like the problem of absolute divine simplicity and relating created things to an absolutely simple essence that's absolutely unlike created things. And I think you have said that it's similar to the way that this is just transferring the same type of problem to the mental realm. And how does it relate to the realm of the external world?
Yeah, and it's the same problem. So you see reoccurring problems throughout the history of philosophy, whether it's dialectics or, which in some senses is actually kind of a dialectics. You see the same problem that rises, that Descartes creates, which we know now is been called the mind-body problem.
Exactly.
You define the mind in complete antithesis as far as properties to physical and bodily things. Then you're going to immediately want to know, well, wait a minute, how do they interact? If they're nothing, they're just the opposite. So you have something like this too within the realm of epistemology. If basic sensation, brute facts, or what Sellers calls the given, is not logical, right? There's no concepts inherent within them, it's just sense datum. Then how does that relate? How do those sensations relate to beliefs and propositional attitudes and concepts and logical things within logical form?
Right. So can we move then to the next question of what about the status of those types of things? That seemed to be a question that we didn't want to delve into, is the ontological status of immaterial objects and concepts. I think it's a perfectly valid question that's been asked.
Perfect segue, yeah.
For centuries, all the way back to Plato. So yeah, and one reason I bring this up is because the system that Stefan outlines in the book pretty clearly in many places and in his more recent talks, it relies on abstracting from from particular instances a universal. And so, if we are an empiricist, why can't I ask, well, what exactly is the metaphysical status of a universal? Where are they? Do they actually exist? Do they have no existence? Are they just in the mind? Are they out? I mean, if they're only in the mind, then how do we know that we're actually matching up again, thanks to the external world? And our whole system of language and meaning is based on some notion of predication, some notion of meaning, and some notion of universals. Language has this feature, this structure to it. So it's natural, I would say, to ask that kind of question, but it's very difficult for an empiricist to grapple with that kind of question. What is the ontological status of numbers? Because they're almost always forced, especially if they're atheistic materialist types, to squish them into matter. But matter is fundamentally not like, as we've just said, things like what we think ideas are, right? Invariant conceptual things. And so I think, if I recall, Stefan just kind of resorted to a token symbol view. Well, it's just, we just call 7 the number 7. It's just a tag that we give, just a title that we give to 7 coconuts. But
what he seemed that he didn't get is he thought that you were denying. So if we were actually looking at what we would call 7 coconuts, he thought, I mean, maybe I'm wrong in this in my analysis, but it seemed to me that he thought that you were saying, well, are you denying that there were 7 coconuts, there's 7 coconuts? But again, he's not realizing that you're asking a justificatory question.
Yeah.
Sure, we can all say there's 7 coconuts.
Right, absolutely,
Are we justified in saying that? He seemed to be missing that point.
Right,
that,
so 2 different
no,
orders
you're not
of
going
questions,
to
right.
You're not going to deny. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So saying that
Which then,
we can experience 7 coconuts, or I see 7 coconuts, is a different order of question of how do I justify the belief or the knowledge of seeing or believing in 7 coconuts?
Correct. And so,
7.
So we have several issues here. We have so many different arguments that, first of all, you can't. So as you'd pointed out, he wants to say that you can abstract that, and then
Right.
therefore, once you receive the abstraction, then you can have that idea and concept, and we'll have to ask questions then. Well, what is that ontological status of concept?
Right.
But for now, he was saying that it then maps on correctly to the world of which these are token instances in which your idea is intentionally pointing out 7 coconuts. But as we've seen that, well, first of all, as Sellers and Davidson point out in the Coherentist, you cannot derive a concept from non-inferential matters of fact, the givens, the sense data. And second of all, as Quine and Duhigg points out, that's not even going to tell you anything about reality anyways, because guess what? It's possibly you could derive multiple theories that are all different ideas about what that data is, and it'll all map on perfectly well to describe the appearances. So got a problem there because that's not going to tell me which one's real, which one's actually, because they're all working. Hence, the underdetermination of data.
If every piece of incoming information is part of some system, then how do I know on the basis of the incoming information which system is correct? It can't tell you.
Yeah. And third, our argument was, and it's also circular, it's assuming what you already have not established. Yeah, it's epistemic bootstrapping.
Which for a classical foundationalist is devastating. You're not allowed to be circular as a classical.
Yeah. So we've got 3 strong arguments there. And then that turns us to the question that you brought up. What is the ontological status of things like numbers? And, where do they exist? So maybe you can help me out with it. Is M0lyneux, is he some variety of a materialist? Because I know he was trying to distance himself from empiricism.
I think so. I think he seems to be an empiricist a materialist who admits that fundamental nature of reality is matter, but matter might have different types of states. So he seems to allow for conceptual realities that in some way maybe are a little more or transcend in some way matter. But that's kind of where I wasn't clear, because I seem to, and if anybody is familiar with his really fleshed out, maybe more specific view on this at some point in his philosophy, you can correct me. But it seemed to be a kind of position where he's generally affirming materialism, but also wanting to kind of have the possibility of some kind of conceptual realities that maybe aren't a higher transcendent reality, but matter in a different state, perhaps, but still fundamentally matter, right? Like energy, maybe in another state, something like that. I think he said something like
this is one problem with materialism. Ask somebody what material is, and they're like, nobody knows. It's like, what? I guess it used to be
energy in different forms.
It used to be kind of like Platonic matter,
little dots.
Aristotelian matter,
dots, dude. It's little dots.
Yeah, is it atoms? Is it potency?
Right.
Then is it with Descartes? Is it extension through space?
Yeah.
Then it's kind of like Bohr's atomic model, and now it's strings and quantum. It's like, so part of the problem with materialism is like nobody even knows what they're talking. How can you base
string cheese on
I'm a
popcorn?
Materialist, but,
string cheese on popcorn is my theory now.
That's right. Like, I'm a materialist, but I don't know what matter is, and nobody through the history of human thought really knows what matter is. That can be problematic, but you can find some underlying threads. It seems that they're committed to, so perhaps they can't define their program very well, but the common kind of thread of materialism or physicalism.
So somebody in the chat, by the way, I don't mean to cut you off, but they're qualifying Stefan's view.
Okay, good.
And again, I don't know that. I mean, this is a follower of Stefan's that says Truth and Downfall says that he believes in materialism, but he believes that the brain creates consciousness and somehow the conditions of free will or free will itself.
Okay, so this segues into the exact point that I want to So maybe he's perhaps, as a lot of materialists, not ontologically committed to, or not committed to any particular ontology about what matter is.
I think so, yeah.
However, the underlying kind of current and theme within all varieties of materialism is a rejection of immaterial entities.
Absolutely, yeah.
So at least, I think M0lyneux would probably agree to that, which leads us, and which led you to bring up the ontological status of numbers. Does it exist? Because if you abstract, then again, number 7 exists within the coconuts, of which you can then get the concept 7. And first, ontological status with concept 7, we'll definitely know that he's not given an immaterial, universal, or transcendent ontological status. I think all of us can agree to that. Whatever side that we're on, that's probably a fair representation of M0lyneux's position. But then we could look at, but is 7 coconuts identical with 7? Is 7 to be found in coconuts? Because if the number 7 was identical with the coconuts, or so there's 7 apples, and there's also 7 oranges. If the number 7 was identical, then apples would be oranges. So there has to be something different there. And furthermore, the reason why that's a problem is because when we speak about numbers, we don't mean that they're particular. Mm-hmm. So within logic, you have these two kind of categories of things that are singular, particular. So this orange, this coconut, this apple.
Well,
all
the irony here is that
within
Stefan's book, he many places says that I can abstract from particular instances to a universal. It's the same thing with numbers in the relationship to the instantiation. To say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, therefore 7, that's appealing to a universal. He may not recognize that, but it's the same move. And the point is that the critique that we're making is essentially the same, whether it's the universal or whether it's the attribution of the number 7, some property that these objects share. Those are invalid moves on empiricist grounds. That's the point.
Exactly. And the thing is, it's the same as the myth of the given,
right?
That the gap problem, that, well, by definition, whatever paradigm that you're committed to philosophically, by definition, we all agree universals are not particulars. So you can't make an identification with 7 coconuts is equal to the concept of 7 and conceptually, because that would be to say that universals are particulars. Yeah, and by definition, they're not. So that argument fails.
I mean, is the number 7 merely a brain state? If it's just a state of chemical reactions in the brain, that's just ridiculous. Now, I'm not saying that Stefan would necessarily say that. He may not. But the point is that as a materialist, you're assuming some conceptual schema within the mind, within some sort of self that's able to organize all of these, ideas into a coherent framework. And I mean, you just, where in empiricism can you get that? You can't. It's an assumption. It's one of the many transcendentals that even Kant talked about. I'm not a Kantian, but I'm just making the point that he talked about the transcendental university about transcendental unity of apperception, right? The idea that there is some unified self that's perceiving all these objects and giving them a coherent unity and framework amongst them, right? So,
which is a transcendental category.
Exactly. Where is that under the microscope? Nowhere.
That's why he's called a transcendental idealist. Kant.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you don't believe that there's an external world, then and you just had a strict coherence theory, then it would lead to idealism, some form of idealism.
By the way, did you see that meme that I showed the guy at the baseball game?
Yeah.
And
the phenomenon to the pneumonia. Yeah.
Yeah, he's sitting behind. He's being blocked by a pillar or something, and so it has written above him. I don't remember if it said the I or the transcendental, and then it's at the pillar. It says phenomenal. So he's looking at the pillar, And on the other side, where the baseball game is, the noumenal world. So it's just kind of, it only makes philosophers laugh. Everybody else is like, what? And it's stupid picture.
Okay, so where do we move next? What's the next? By the way, thank you for those super chats. We will be answering those as we come to the close here, moving through our analysis of the debate. We've been going for hour 13. We'll keep it up here for a little while longer, but where do we move next? What's the next thing that you?
Well, let me just wrap that up by saying, because you started to touch on this. If everything is reducible to matter, even if you have a kind of a sophisticated notion, like perhaps, and I'll give M0lyneux the benefit of the doubt, let's say he has kind of sophisticated version of emergentism or something like that, where maybe he doesn't want to have an ontological reduction to matter itself, but it's causally emergent from the material substrate. Then, as I ask my class, when we say things are true, and we'll use, clear examples like 1 + 1 is 2, we have kind of a notion of permanence, that when we wake up tomorrow, it's not going to be 5 or 7. And I guess we'd expect in hundreds of years that that's not going to change too. But the very nature of matter is changeable. It's mutable. It's what is going to guarantee, and it could be even, if we say we have a correct abstraction of the number 7, why should we expect that would remain tomorrow or the next day? And if we can't expect, there's nothing from our material substrate that would guarantee that kind of epistemic certitude, then why should we think that's something that could be known at all? Since what's known would be, again, 1 + 1 = 2 will be true tomorrow, the next day, and etc. And it ties into the problem of adduction as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll just end with that.
Okay. So then we kind of moved into the realm of, let's see, I mentioned underdetermination. There's a critique Stefan has of classical astronomy, but this is in many ways bound up with Aristotle's philosophy itself, and thus there's no properly basic beliefs. Our brains derive universal concepts from particulars, thus the power of science, minds, and reason. We'd covered that. Moral rules are invented so that you wouldn't steal. Then we have this sort of a strange move of in the realm of ethics, because I think the majority of his book, UPB, is based on ethical framework and how do we do ethics. So he seems to be really interested in doing ethics. But the problem I still see is that you are not getting to a ground for those ethics. And so he's utilizing the transcendental argumentation, which I give him credit for. And so, when he makes those moves, I think those moves do refute people like JF, right? So I know JF has wanted to debate M0lyneux. He's wanted to go in that direction of saying that there are no transcendental categories, no laws bind anybody in any logical sense. There's no, as a more consistent nihilist. But I think that it puts Stefan in kind of a horns of the dilemma position of like, well, you're either going to have to go in the direction of what we're saying to justify ethical claims, right? In a universal sense. You're going to need a way to justify universals and universal categories, or you're going to need to move more in the direction of a nihilistic approach. Would you say that that's an accurate way? I mean, if you want to be consistent, you can either move towards nihilism or move towards a position where you can justify these kinds of claims. And so the way I phrased it was, the crux of it all comes down to this. Arguments against God are typically premised on rejecting anything immaterial. But arguments themselves, numbers, logic, etc., which are necessary conditions of arguing, are actually immaterial. And so therefore, if you cut out from the outset the branch that you're sitting on, do you want to fall into nihilism?
Right. And what's interesting, I think you pointed this out in the video, is that this is exactly the course the history of philosophy took.
Exactly, right. That's a great point.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to do ethics and we're going to have universally preferable behavior that is in some sense something that you ought. I mean, ethics needs an ought to do ethics, or it's just subjective. And he wants to overcome the problem of subjectivity and relativism. Then we need a metaphysics. We need an epistemic argumentation that's sound, and you can't get that from resorting to pragmatism. Pragmatism goes back to...
Now, somebody asked a good question here, which direction would Darwinism go? Now, it seems to me that M0lyneux had rejected a kind of Darwinianism, or at least tried to separate. Did he mention that in the video? No, I think he'll replace it with a pragmatism that both share kind of
he did say
underlying.
Something like that it seems to point out problems. He said something like it does point in the direction of problems. I don't remember exactly how he phrased it, but something like that.
Yeah, that so even if he distances himself from that, the underlying presupposition in kind of Darwinism, Darwinist account of veracity, justification, knowledge, and stuff like that is going to be the same as pragmatism.
Right.
So the idea is that in both cases, it's a type of pragmatism. One's, within, the notion of being advantageous for a species, and therefore those traits.
Right.
The truth ends up, and knowledge ends up being advantageous for a species, and therefore those traits would be passed down, and eventually a species gets, knowledge within their community or something like that at some type of epoch. Mm-hmm. But so the same assumption within pragmatism too, that it ends up being true because it works. Now, all we need to do, so anytime that somebody makes a claim like that, if you say all swans are white, or this is how it works, all you need to do is find one counterexample conceptually that you could think that will then therefore refute. In this case, a black swan would work. In the case of, well, couldn't evolution account for how we developed truth or knowledge? And likewise, couldn't pragmatism, basically, things are true because they pragmatically work out for this is how we develop the notion of truth, or this is what makes something true. So the counterexample would be, well, it could be that you have false beliefs that end up being promoting survival, or false beliefs that end up being pragmatic. So within the case of evolution, I think I've shared this one with you before, is that suppose you have a belief that wild grizzly bears are cute and cuddly and should be hugged. And the best way to hug them and love them, since they're cute and cuddly, is to run from them.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have a false belief that ends up promoting survival.
There are black swans, by the way. Black swans are identified by the gold chains that they wear. See a black swan, that's how you know. All right.
Yeah, in the music.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that serves as a counterexample for, and we could think of similar counterexamples that would refute the idea that pragmatism is what defines what is true. We can think of all types of false beliefs that end up being quite
pragmatic.
Practical or pragmatic.
That's a good point. Notions like evidences, the accumulation of evidences, that we should believe something merely because of the accumulation of evidences and because they accord with rationality. What exactly is this? As you pointed out, I didn't even get to this in my notes because a lot of my notes I didn't actually translate into the debate because I didn't know where it was going. And when you're having a conversational style, thing, you don't want to keep referring back to notes, but there's an assumption of neutrality, which you critique often.
Yes.
We critique often. We didn't really get to the me questioning his assumption of neutrality or an epistemically privileged position, which you've mentioned many times. We didn't get to what exactly is the meaning of meaning. Another meta level question about words and sentences. I wanted to talk at some point about
depends what you mean.
Depends on what you mean. Depends on what you mean.
I wanted to get to sentences because there's a lot of transcendental argumentation that's very fascinating in the world of sentences, but that's okay. We didn't get to that. Maybe if there's a part 2, he and I can cover some of those topics. But
I hope so. Yeah. I think again, M0lyneux, if you're listening, I give you a big props. I thought you did excellent. I thought you did well. Very amicable. I think everybody was impressed, and so I just want to say that look, I'm a professional philosopher and professor of philosophy. None of these critiques are aimed at you as a person. And what you do, I think we all think that you're doing wonderful things. Again, this is, just within the realm of ideas, of which both Jay and I put out our own papers and our own ideas to be critiqued. In fact, this is what professors do. So again, don't let this, I hope this doesn't come off that this is any personal attack or anything. In fact, I thought personally you did. I have nothing but praise for the way that you handled it and everything that you discussed. And I think that you would agree, too, that it's fair as far as the ideas that we're all presenting, that we're free to be able to discuss and critique these so that we all can come together and hopefully find out, well, what is actually true.
Yeah, so, and I think, similarly, I want to eventually get back to a response to the critique that Dr. Malpass and Matt Dillahunty did to the Dillahunty debate, because right after we did the debate, they did a whole round table. So I'd eventually like to respond to that in the future too, because they did a amicable response to the debate in the same way that we're doing an amicable response to the debate with Stefan. So I think that pretty much covers most of the central problems, and I think that shout out to Church of the Eternal Logos. He did a great analysis of the debate too, pointing out the state of the question, which was basically just illustrating that the development of the Enlightenment tradition took a certain trajectory for a reason. It's not to say that because it went down that trajectory that therefore they're all correct. It's just simply to say that the assumptions of the Enlightenment philosophers led to a series of arguments and views that were trying to achieve consistency within those frameworks, and what it led to was phenomenalism and solipsism. And in fact, I've commented on this many times. There were some people commenting underneath the video saying that phenomenalism is not solipsism. Actually, it is. It just you might as well say they're the same thing, and they lead to this. I mean, they're not identical, but you read the Bonjour text, and there's a great discussion of phenomenalism, how it's just essentially end result is solipsism. And that's why philosophy in the 20th century just kind of discarded a lot of this stuff. It just kind of said, we're not going to answer these questions, right? Quine comes back, restates Hume. Nobody's responded to Hume. Let's just set these philosophical issues aside and just operate as if...
bracketing, yeah.
Yeah, just forget this stuff, man.
Hey, kids, you want to become a prisoner in your own mind? Mm-hmm. Try phenomenology. Try solipsism.
Right, so sense data theory of logic itself is bankrupt. Explanations and justifying. In the book, page 29, he does refer often to the need to give rigid explanations and justifications for our beliefs, and that's what we're trying to do. Right, we're trying to say yes, let's do that, but can it be done on the empiricist starting points? And I would say no. So definitely some good movements in the self-detonating arguments that Stefan has, which are powerful philosophical guns to bring forth. We're just simply bringing forth that same type of gun at a meta level to the higher level questions of how we justify our assumptions and our worldview as a whole. So that's my take. Do you have any thoughts you want to leave us with before we get to the super chats on the debate itself? Anything we didn't cover?
We didn't really talk about transcendental arguments. Now, this is going to be hard for people because, again, we're historically conditioned
not to think
to think in a certain way.
Yeah.
In fact, to think in a very kind of classical, foundationalist way. And not this kind of philosophical and conceptual introspection, like you said, a paradigmatic and meta level.
Right.
Which is exactly what transcendental arguments do. So we're used to the type of arguments as deductive or inductive, and to take a reflective look at a meta level of conditions for the possibility of arguments is something quite difficult. So, nobody get frustrated and upset when you hear a transcendental argument. You're not going to oftentimes just get it right away. This is kind of a conditioning. And when you do get it, you really do see the strength of it. And also, there isn't just one type of transcendental argument.
Right.
So I might have been worried watching the debate that the type of self-destructive, what do you call it,
He called him self-detonating.
Self-detonating, yeah, which is a good term. Like the sort of argument that Aristotle brings up and its logical works is a type of transcendental argument, but to then think that that's exactly what a transcendental argument is, is not true. So there's many different types of transcendental arguments, and it's obviously, as we know, it's Immanuel Kant who is the first one to identify that form of argument, although it might be implicit in other philosophers prior to him. But we'd certainly argue it's implicit within the church fathers in the way that they argue. He is the first one to name that form, that you establish a conclusion not deductively but transcendentally, that without that conclusion being true, then there would be no possibility of experience, arguments, logic.
The necessary conditions of experience are assumed in experience or in cognition. Exactly.
Right. And then again, a transcendental argument in form is not the same thing as a transcendental argument for the existence of God. So, in other words, just because you could find a flaw or an error in somebody's transcendental argument does not mean, therefore, that it maps over to being like for transcendental arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah, that would be the fallacy in it, and yeah, exactly. And plus, they're not the same; they're not identical. So it's just different.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. And next time you and I do a chat, I have a bunch of chats that cover transcendental arguments. You can find those in the archives. People want to get deeper into those. I've probably done 5 or 6 lengthy talks on those. But we can come back next time and maybe just do a talk just on transcendental argumentation. Talk about the history, talk about Kant, talk about Van Til and Bonson, talk about where we disagree with all of those people, talk about how there's a difference between a transcendental argument and the transcendental argument for God, the form of a transcendental argument. So maybe the next talk that you and I do, we can do something on all that. And also keep in mind, everybody, the book that Father Deacon and I are putting together will have numerous chapters and discussions of these very topics. So the paper that he presented, the paper that I presented, will most likely be turned into probably chapters in our book, I would assume. So look for that. Hopefully we'll be done with that by the end of this year. And it will be an orthodox evaluation and assessment and usage of transcendental arguments. So you ready for Super Chats?
Absolutely.
All right, let's see these. Skeptical Storm for $5 says, Jay, would you consider scaling down the vocabulary in your videos and debates and using more definitions of words not commonly used and more examples? I mean, I could definitely try to do more of that, but the problem is that some of these words are philosophy terms, and they really, can't be. I mean, it's hard to. I mean, what do you say for a transcendental argument? I mean, you could say a presupposition. So you might as well just try to learn some of the terms at least. I do have some articles where I've defined some of the theological terms and philosophical terms, but you can also make use of Google and look those things up. But I will give Stefan credit for being very good at creative analogies that make things applicable to a mass audience, and that's one of the difficulties of philosophy is translating these ideas into frameworks that are helpful to everybody. So we can definitely be better at that. I don't know how much I can reframe things, but we'll try. That's part of the reason we do tutoring. That's part of the reason Father Deacon is going to be doing a class Monday. That's part of the reason why you can subscribe to my Patreon for one-on-one tutoring in philosophy if you want to do that. But thank you for that advice. Skeptical Strom, not Storm, Strom. Katie Myers, $5. Request for Jamie to do an analysis of Frozen as a progression of the Disney princess. Actually, yeah, she would probably enjoy doing that. By the way, after this stream with Father Deacon at 7 o'clock Central, 7:30, somewhere in there, Jamie and I will be doing a stream tonight about more Hollywood madness. We're going to talk about the music industry. We don't talk a whole lot about that. I focus so much on movies, and actually Jamie's done quite a bit of research on the music industry and the pop stars and the craziness of the music industry. And we're also going to talk about this under-reported, under-remembered, under-recalled, under-determined craziness of Luca Magnotta. If you don't know the story of that, yes, I watched the Netflix documentary. We're going to be commenting on that. I remember in 2012 when all this was in the news, and it's, wow, what a crazy story. But what I didn't know was that Luca's whole story was tied to his obsession with Hollywood. So we're going to be tying this into the narcissism of the Hollywood magic mirror machine. So we'll be talking about that, Jamie and I, at 7:30. Jolene K, $15. Thank you for the theology and the philosophy. Their comfort and peace for the soul. Excellent debate between you and Stefan. Finally able to watch it this morning. Well, thank you, Jolene. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was beneficial. Hopefully we can have follow-up exchange. Woo Lad, £5. What do you think of Plato's theory of epistemic recollection and his argument for the preexistence of souls? I think it's a terrible argument, personally. Number one, we don't believe in the transmigration of souls, and I don't think the argument itself is coherent, that because you had a past life, you're remembering the forms. Yeah, I mean, that avoids the problem of Platonism, how you relate the immaterial invariant realm to the realm of flux. And just to say that you're remembering the realm of the forms actually doesn't solve that dilemma. Do you have any take on that, Father Deacon?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. First of all, Aristotle gave a pretty good refutation of that too, or at least a way out. But it's all these theories are gonna be open to the same critiques that we just gave here tonight.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why that's another thing too, is that transcendental arguments are not in terms of worldviews, comparing worldviews. Again, you're actually limited in the number of moves that you can go in the domains of epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics. Like, there's not that many options. People say you have to refute every single worldview, and if there's a million worldviews out there, you can't prove your position until you refute 1 million worldviews. No, there's only a limited number, right, of ways to go in any position, right? You can't. I mean, the world is either created or not, right? I mean, that's a limiting factor there in the steps that you can take in your starting points. So let's see who's next. Drunken Warlock, $10. I understand he is too relativistic, but what do you think of Spangler's overall model of the rise of cultures as historical organisms and how they turn in a civilization when they die? I have a video on Spangler and this, and so I agree with that analysis. So it's very similar in many ways to Daniel, the prophet Daniel's analysis of the various empires that come in succession, or the layers of the big idol, right? The golden image that Nebuchadnezzar erects. So that's similar to the phases and the spirit of the age, you could say, the organism approach of Spangler. But yes, ultimately Spangler's system is relativistic, but he's very insightful when it comes to looking at the spirit of an age. So Spangler has a lot of insight. Do you have any thoughts on Spangler?
No, that's good. Yeah, nicely said.
GGG. Oh man, I lost my GGG. $20. Thank you, GGG. $20 whole dollars for, and no comments, but we love you, GGG. That was a fat super chat. Much appreciated. Hans Lager. $10. Thank you for what you do, Jay. There's more than one person in my church who are there, partly because of your work, from a 6-month catechumen. Well, I'm honored, and thank you for that. Those kind words, Hans, and we are growing. You know, the Discord is growing, so we're getting more and more apologists out there in the field to till the land and do the work. And thank you to Father Deacon for joining us and all the other people in the Discord. Shout out to the Ortho Bros. Thomas W, $5. If one coconut is the same as 1, the numeral 1, then all coconuts must be the exact same size. If not, there can only be 1.1 coconut, 9 coconut, 3.145. Yeah, I think any approach to where you make an isomorphic identification, or you make one definitional of an object in the world, it would lead to all kinds of absurdities.
Yeah, that's the same argument. Mm-hmm. By the way, I'm just looking at some of these chats here. Somebody said that I stated I'm a materialist. For the record, I saw somebody stated. Can you hear me?
You cut out for a second. You're back.
I'm back.
You there?
Yeah, and I'm back.
Okay.
I just wanted to clear up for the record. It seems like somebody stated that in the chat that I said I'm a materialist. Let's just make that clear. I'm not a materialist.
You'd be the first materialist Orthodox deacon, or maybe not the first. I don't know. Maybe.
The first materialist immaterialist.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, I don't think anybody in our circles is a materialist. So I don't know about that. But let's see, moving through these. Doorman, $362.
That's a great Greg Bonch impersonation. Jerry. If you've ever seen the Matitix-Bonson debate, it's pretty great. By the way, I'm trying to get Matitix to come on. He seems like he will, but when they debated, there's a point in the debate where Bonson goes, Jerry, not. Bonson actually throws out a not, like, Wayne's World, not. In a debate, Bonson throws out a not in the debate. Funny stuff. Anyway, thank you for that, Doorman. Shining Diamond, $2. Did you notice Ask Yourself was trying to help Stefan? Well, of course he was. We know that Ask Yourself is not the most astute philosopher, and so certainly he would be trying to gain points with anyone. Made by Jim Bob, $25, and made by Jim Bob, $25. Wow! Hope you meant to send the same $50 or 2 super chats.
Hallelujah!
Thank you, made by Jim Bob. Jim Bob, of course. Shout out to Jim Bob. Go follow him on Instagram, and go check out his Based website. He has some killer humor in his comics. He is one of the premier satirists of the comic world, so definitely follow his material. Had 2 good discussions with Jim Bob, and I'm sure we'll have more in the future. Just been busy of late. He says, if words are circular and logic requires words, is the claim words are circular invalid? I would say no. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, this gets to, in some sense, all things are circular.
Right.
Now, so this moves then into the justification. So I'd say within your own sphere of reasoning and language, if you don't have the necessary conditions for the possibility of knowledge found as your first epistemic principles within divine revelation in the person, the theanthropos, who's in a position to solve the epistemic problem, then all systems are viciously circular and nothing can be justified. And so I argue this in multiple papers that, that would be a problem. You're locked within your own sphere of reasoning. It's all circular and invalid. And therefore, we need help from one who's in a position to know that we establish as the necessary presupposition for the possibility of any knowledge, and then that God has to look in his divine revelation in a way that is accessible, because it could be the necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge, and we have no access to it. And so as I argue that this has to be a God that can incarnate, a God that has the divine energies, right, is not just an absolute divine simple monad, that in various things like that. So that's what grounds. So we don't have a problem with circularity. It ultimately all meanings and words end up being circular. We'd say that we're the only ones uniquely in a position to actually justify that,
is, exactly.
given this.
Yeah, I would say that Gödel sentences, as they're sometimes called, are examples of this type of circularity, and they're not actually contradictions. They're just a feature of the world itself. I mean, that's the thesis of Gödel, Escher, Bach, right? The world demonstrates to us this sort of circularity, just like the artwork of M.C. Escher demonstrates the same sort of circularity. We wouldn't say that, oh, your artwork is invalid, Escher, because you have a circularity. No, it's just a feature of the mathematics of his artwork is similar to the fugue of Bach, Beethoven, and they're circular. Right? There's a circular pattern in the music because reality is created. It's going to necessarily be circular. I'm not talking about the Ouroboros. I'm just saying that circularity is unavoidable, and so transcendental argumentation is a way, a means to show that actually all systems at some point, just like the incompleteness theorem shows, are circular and therefore appeal outside of themselves. That doesn't mean that we have to resort to irrationality or postmodernism or Thomas Kuhn's thing where we're both in ivory towers. We compare the systems. So that's the answer. But great question there, Jim Bob. Sadie Rochelle, she says for $5. Thank you, Dr. Ananias, and thank you, Jay. Great discussion. Thank you, Sadie. Much appreciated. You have been a longtime supporter of Jay's analysis, and it's much appreciated. Dalton, $15. Can you both explain why circular logic is a problem at the normative level and not a problem at the paradigmatic worldview level? Yes, absolutely. It's one of my favorite questions because this is what the classical foundationalist always brings up. How would you answer that, Father Deacon? How would you answer this challenge? Well, now, wait a minute. If we can't be circular in our arguments at the courthouse when we're arguing about our parking ticket, you can't be circular there. How do you get to be circular when you're making these transcendental arguments? How's that fair?
So again, it goes back to the exact previous conversation that we just had, that that we can ground. So the problem with circularity is really a problem that we pointed out of epistemic bootstrapping, that you are using something and assuming that it's valid and it works for the purposes that you want it to do before you've established that. So that's the type of circularity. For example, tautology in some sense is circularity. It's not that we have problems with every form of circularity. It's in the sense that you haven't established the legitimate use, and therefore you can just ignore that and then use that.
Yeah.
And so what we'll say, the reason why we get out of the problem of vicious circularity and epistemic bootstrapping is because at a paradigmatic level, presupposing the only unique conditions that will satisfy for the possibility of any knowledge, morality, or experience, science, etc., we're able, in a first things first sort of way, to actually therefore ground what we're using. And therefore, of course, it ends up being circular because all systems are circular, but it doesn't end up being epistemic bootstrapping and viciously circular, whereas every other system will. Why? Because you haven't actually established your criteria for justification before you've established your, and so you're going in circles there. Your epistemic bootstrapping. Yeah. So that's what ends up being problematic.
Exactly. All claims, all knowledge claims, all factual claims, they're all theory laden. That's the point we're trying to make. So there's no way to avoid your views being theory laden, right? If Correct. I say to you, prove logic to me without using logic, it's not possible.
Absolutely. And that's not special pleading right. too, because once we use the transcendental for the uniquely in the orthodox sense, the transcendental argument for the existence of God, then we do have warrant and justification for making arguments, establishing the coherence of a paradigm in a right. justified way, whereas nobody else can, and therefore it ends up being the impossibility of the contrary.
Right. Because
none of you can, and because of this, we're justified, whereas not. So that gets us out of the fallacy of special pleading.
All right, Nicodemus the Pharisee, $2. What will convert M0lyneux, tag or the 5 ways? I would say that if M0lyneux does convert, we certainly would hope everybody converts, that the predilection and interest that he seems to have in the strength of self-detonating arguments would lead him to accept tag, I would guess, because
we're taking those self-detonating arguments and we're applying them to worldviews as a whole. So that would be my guess, but who knows? A lot of people do, by the way, move in the direction of theism on the basis of the 5 ways. So, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily sound, right? So the persuasive psychological aspect of an argument is different from the soundness of an argument. So we have to be careful.
Great point too. And so, and a lot of these questions come up that, well, right. I find that they're more persuasive. Why don't you use them? Well, I mean, are you really encouraging us to use something that we don't believe is true?
Right.
And furthermore,
why don't you just use a bad argument if it works? Right. That would be pragmatic.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm sure psychedelics will convert a lot of people too, right? But like, so just take this and you'll believe in God. That's not something that I'm willing to do.
Why don't I just mind control? Why don't we just use MK on everybody to make them believe
why
in
don't we
God?
just do Yeah, exactly. That's actually probably the most persuasive argument. Check out my MK argument.
Come get in my pod, bro. I'm going to convert you. Like, that way they're already baptized because they're in like a floating saltwater pod.
Yeah.
They're auto baptism. Anyway. Scrow 83, $10. No, wait a minute. I skipped one. Hold on. Doorman again says, I will second the request of an analysis of Frozen and the archetype of the Disney princess. Also esoteric analysis of Resident Evil. So yes, I just got busy. I had to leave before I could do the Resident Evil thing. But it looks like the Karunkadunk virus continues on. So maybe it is appropriate to do the Resident Evil video, which we'll do soon. I'll try to do that this week. But thank you for that reminder. And actually, M0lyneux had a great analysis of. It was Frozen. He did a good analysis of Frozen back when the first Frozen came out. I remember that analysis. I like that video of his. But let's see, Scrow 83 for $10. Just because. Thank you. Just because. Evan Schultz, $10. Hats off to Jay and Father Deacon. Can you tell us a bit about the logic class that you'll be doing Monday? Thank you to the nerds, ortho nerds. So tell us a little bit more about your logic class Monday, and again, where people can find it at your channel. Your channel is linked. What the cost is, how long it is, and what you're going to be discussing, and then we will call it a night on this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me know if you can hear me okay. Yeah. So basically, this is going to be a university level course. And it's actually a pretty good deal for the money. So with your $40 purchase to my PayPal, you'll get an email confirmation that you're registered for the first lecture. And we can have a series of lectures too. And with that payment, all of which you can find I have a video and all the information linked under that video. But with that $40 payment, you'll actually get, because I'm a professor and I use the Hurley, A Concise Introduction to Logic, that book, if you were to purchase that, is about $80, $90. So what I was able to get for you guys is a free PDF copy, as being a professor. So with your registration, you'll get that book. And also I have slides that I've constructed for each chapter. I have notes. And so what we'll do on Monday, for those that you sign up, is we'll actually do a live lecture on Chapter 1 of Patrick Hurley's Logic. So this is intended for a lot of you that logic is like a prerequisite course for philosophy. So we're going to understand and analyze what are good arguments, what are bad arguments, how do we find implicit arguments within reading, television, various media. We'll also study how to identify the forms and construct forms of arguments, how to identify informal fallacies, and all of this should be of a great interest for any of you that are interested in apologetics, defending the faith, in philosophy, in debate. This is a prerequisite. You need to, and for those of you who are not, it's actually just good mental calisthenics for thinking in general in whatever aspect of life that you're in. So there's just so many benefits. Everybody will benefit. And again, it'll be a big bang for your buck, what you're getting with this package.
Only 7 coconuts to take the greatest logic class in history. Mail Dr. Ananias your coconuts. And
Yeah, you can pay me in coconuts or pesos or US dollar.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Father Deacon. Follow your boy right there. I got my links. Follow me on Twitter. Follow me on the Instagram. We want to have all those backups. I do unique material to Instagram and to Twitter. Not everything is on YouTube. Not everything is in one place. So be sure and follow me on all those outlets. Subscribe to Jay's Analysis at the website if you want to. $5 a month, $60 a year. You can also subscribe there at the join button on YouTube itself and the YouTube membership. By the way, we will do the last of Genesis. I know that people are saying, where's your Genesis part? That will be soon. I had to do that conference last weekend. So that will be next up on the plate is to finish the Genesis lecture. We will do the last 10 chapters as the end of Genesis. So we'll have all those 6 lectures covering Genesis complete. We'll be doing the life of Joseph. Will be really neat. Thank you guys so much. Hopefully you're enjoying. Welcome to the channel, everybody that's new. If you're here from the world of Stefan, we welcome you and thank you. And hopefully we can have a future discussion with Stefan and exchange, see where it goes in terms of the world of debate. But thank you for that review analysis, Father Deacon. Thank you for your logic class. Thank you to everybody who sent super chats. God bless. And again, in 2 hours, Jamie and I will be analyzing the music industry, craziness there, and the wild story of Luca, whatever his name is, the crazy dude, Magnata, whatever. Wild, crazy story, and it relates to Hollywood and the obsession, the narcissistic obsession of the realm of Hollywood. And by the way, if you didn't see, check out Tristan's video about Joaquin, because Tristan had some good comments about Joaquin and his goofy statements at the Oscars, which are also applicable to what we're going to be talking about. But the whole realm of the vegan madness, the craziness of the world of veganism. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Thank you, Father. And everybody have a good night.
Thank you. Blessings. Bye, guys.